Thank you for joining me for session 10 of Explore the Bible series, The Gospel of Mark. Our title is Purifies, and the text is Mark chapter 11, verse 15 through 19, and chapter 12, verse 41 through 44. Now, the way that I started the lesson with my class is I just asked them, what are some of the signs of a society that is in decline? And they gave me a number of them. And I found an article that I used to supplement some of their comments, but most everything they said I found in this article as well. And we had a good conversation about that. The article that I found was called 10 Signs of a Culture's End. And just to give you some examples of the things this author said, the first sign of the end of a culture is that of a society which no longer worships or acknowledges God. And the class had said something along those lines as well. A second indicator, this author said, of the end of a culture is the decline of the family. A third important indicator of cultural demise is a society's low view of life. And it just continues on like that. We had a good amount of discussion in describing what the signs were when a culture was going down instead of going up. And then the way I transitioned was to say, that's what Jesus is saying when you come to this story about this conflict in the temple. He is conveying that the days of the temple are on decline, and in a few short days there will be no need for this temple. Now, on either side of the story that we have for our Sunday school lesson is this story of Jesus cursing the fig tree. You know the story. As he's approaching Jerusalem that day, he sees this fig tree with its leaf out, and he goes to check it to see if it has fruit. There's no fruit, and he curses the tree. And then at the end of the day, when they're leaving, or the next day when they arrive, they see that this fig tree has withered to the roots, which means it'll never produce fruit. That is an acted parable, a symbolism of what was taking place in the temple. The temple had lost its purpose, its significance. The temple was there for sacrifices, but there's going to be a sacrifice made in just a few days in which the sacrifices at the temple are no longer needed. And so Jesus was saying this temple and its sacrifices are obsolete. They're on their way out. Now, in this passage, the first point of our lesson, beginning in chapter 11, verse 15 through 17, talks about cleansed. And let me just make some comments about the text. It says in verse 15, they came to Jerusalem, and he went into the temple and began to throw out those buying and selling. Now notice it says he threw out people who were buying as well as selling. So it wasn't just the corruption of people who were selling, it also involved the people who were buying. And you can read in your commentaries the reason for the buying and the selling that took place. It says he overturned the tables of the money changers and the chairs of those selling doves. Those were the poorest of people who came to get a sacrifice, and would not permit anyone to carry goods through the temple. What Jesus did is he disrupted everything that was involved in the sacrifices. The people who were buying sacrifices, they were disrupted. The people selling, they were disrupted. The people who had the poorest of means in which to buy a sacrifice, a dove, they were disrupted. And the people who were carrying these vessels through the temple. The court of the Gentiles was huge. It was 500 yards long. It was 503 yards wide. It was approximately 35 acres. It was absolutely huge. This was Herod's temple. And in that day, the leaders, the dictators, would build monstrosities to their legacy. And that's what Herod is doing. This area at the time of Jesus was not called the court of the Gentiles, but there were these walls that prevented the Gentiles from going further, and the Jewish women could go a little closer, and then there was another wall, and the Jewish men could go closer, and then they could only go so far because there was a wall that prevented them from going to where the priests were. And what What's the commentators say about these people who were carrying vessels? Some of them have said in times past it was people who were using it as a shortcut, and people were carrying goods through there. But it specifically says they were not permitted to carry goods through the temple, and the idea is it was probably a reference to vessels that carried this money that was being exchanged for the temple tax, or maybe bearing gifts that would be used for sacrifices. But all three of those are testimonies of Jesus disrupting the sacrificial system, because that's going to be obsolete. That's going to be cleansed of being needed in the future. He says in verse 17, he was teaching them, is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of thieves. The first is a quote from Isaiah. And notice specifically, Jesus is referring to the temple not as a place of sacrifice, but as a place of prayer. And he's going to make a sacrifice that's going to make it possible for people to pray everywhere and anywhere at any time. And that house of prayer, we know today, is the people of God, the church. And then he says, you've made it a den of thieves. A den of thieves is not where you rob. A den of thieves is where you go back to security and safety after you've done your robbing. And so he is saying you're treating this temple as a place of security after you've committed your crime. And Jesus cleanses the temple of that. And the way I sought to apply that to the classes is I asked them, what needs to be removed so that our worship is pure and expresses trust in God? What motives do we need to examine? What priorities, what actions, what are some impure reasons people have today for worshiping God? And then we discuss that. The second point of the lesson is feared, chapter 11, verses 18 through 19. The chief priest and the scribes heard it and started looking for a way to kill him. For they were afraid of him because of the whole crowd was astonished by his teaching. Whenever evening came, they would go out of the city. Now the chief priest, that's probably reference to Caiaphas and Annas. Annas was the father-in-law to Caiaphas, and Annas had been the chief priest for a number of years, and the Romans displaced him and put his son-in-law in that role. The scribes were the experts in the scriptures, and notice they heard what Jesus had done in the temple, and what was their reaction to that? They looked for ways to kill him. Now they're very aware that the 10th commandment has in it, thou shalt not kill. And it says, for they were afraid of him. Their power, their position, their prominence was being threatened. Now the crowd, it says they're astonished. This is a favorite word for Mark to describe the crowd's reaction to Jesus. And the idea is they don't know what to think of Jesus. He doesn't fit any mold. He doesn't fit into any pattern or any pigeonhole that they can think of. He's always crossing these social boundaries, and he just stands in amazement. He's just an amazement to them. And then the evening comes and they leave the city. I asked the class, what is comfortable religion? If you looked at someone's attendance record, what would comfortable religion look like in their attendance record? What would comfortable religion look like if you could examine their giving record? People who are living a comfortable religion, what would their giving record look like? And then, what would it look like if their worship of Christ was to become pure? What is it that we fear when we begin to push against that? What would pure religion look like in contrast to comfortable religion? And why is it that people fear making those kind of commitments to Christ? The third point is observed in Mark chapter 12, verse 41 to 42. So we go from the picture of these religious leaders who are determined to kill Jesus and looking for a way to do that, to now we're at the end of the day, and Jesus is watching this widowed woman who is giving her gift. And what Mark has done, he's set up a contrast. The religious leaders reveal impure worship that refuses to trust God, but here is a woman of pure worship who is trusting totally in God. And this point says, observe. And so I read through the text, give some example, give some explanation, and just step back and I ask the class, just tell me, what's this look like through the eyes of Jesus? It says in verse 41, sitting across from the temple treasury, he watched how the crowd dropped money into the treasury. Many rich people were putting in large sums of money. Then a poor widow came and dropped in 2 tiny coins worth very little. The word poor to describe this widow is not one that's describing someone in the lower economic of a society. This word is used to describe abject poverty. This woman lives on the verge of starving, of not having enough to eat. Now, what was set up in the court were 13 different giving receptacles, and they had like a trumpet-like opening that you could pour your offering in. Now, of course, they didn't have offering envelopes and checks, and so they had to do it with coinage, and they were made out of copper. These were designated offerings. For example, you could give an offering to help buy the lambs that were being purchased by the priest for the offering that was offered every day, morning and evening, there in the temple. You could give money to help with the benevolence of the poor. And so you chose where you wanted this money to go. And of course, the rich brought their money in their bags, and they made a big show out of pouring it in there. And there would be the clanking of the metal coins on the trumpet-like device that led to this box that they were giving to. And yet this little widow, she probably made no sound hardly at all. And so I just asked them, let's just imagine what's going on. What is it that we're seeing when we look at this, and to contrast these two people? For example, there's men versus a woman. There's rich and there is poor. There is the powerful and there is weak. There are those with families, and there is this widow. There are those who are proud, and here is this woman who's humble. There's comfortable giving, and then there's this costly giving. There's recognition by the way that you give. And then there's anonymity by the way she gives. And all of this is testifying to the purity of their worship and testifying if they totally trust in God. So we just simply talked about what is it that you see, that you're observing, that Jesus wanted his disciples to see. The last point is commended. That is, what did Jesus praise? What did he approve of? What did Jesus see that he commends to the disciples? And then we read the text. Summoning his disciples, he said to them, truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others, for they all gave out of their surplus. But she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. So Jesus praises, he commends her gift. What is it that her gift revealed about her heart? What does it reveal about her motivations? What does it reveal about her desires? And so I asked that and solicited requests from them. It showed that she loved God. Jesus commends that. Her giving revealed that. It shows that she trusts in God. Jesus commends that. It shows obedience to God. It shows her desire to support the work of God. It shows the purity of her motives. And in contrast, what did the giving of the rich represent? Well, theirs was required giving, dutiful giving, joyless giving, visionless giving. They didn't really see the greatness of what their giving was going to be. Their giving was stingy. It was non-costly. It was prideful, maybe even minimal. These are the contrasts, and Jesus praises giving that reveals pure worship and a total trust in God. The way I closed the lesson is I took a piece of paper, and in one corner I folded it in half and then folded it again until it was this size. And then in one corner, one of those sections, it makes 8 sections. In this one section, I wrote the text, Mark 11, verse 15 through 19, chapter 12, verse 41 to 44. And then I wrote the summary lesson, Jesus desires pure worship expressed by total trust in God. And then the 4 points of the lesson, cleansed, feared, observed, commended. And I asked the class for the next 7 days, would they take this sheet of paper, and one section represents Monday, another Tuesday, another Wednesday, all through the next 7 days, and would they just read through this text one more time and just ask the Lord on Monday, what is it, Lord, that you want to cleanse in terms of my worship of you? What is it that I'm fearful of in coming to total trust in you? What is it that I observe as I look at my spiritual life, and what's there that you commend? And then just make a note in each of those boxes for each of those days. Again, as I want to remind you, you're simply wanting to take your lesson and you're wanting to get one more shot at teaching this truth. You want them to go out of there not only remembering what the lesson was about, you want them to go out of there practicing that lesson. So, this is a suggestion for you. God bless you. Thank you for teaching God's Word.